All right, maybe we'll get started. I'm Monty Sharma. I'm Managing Director at MassDigi. Good, that works too. I post far too many pictures and videos of donuts, so I can't find the actual donut video I was looking for, but I promise I'll tweet it out later. MassDigi does a lot of things, but one of the things we do is we run this thing called the Summer Innovation Program, where we work with students from schools all over. Last summer, we had students from 19 different colleges work together to build a game from scratch. Having done this now for 7 years, we have seen a lot of common mistakes, and I should say that all of the errors are our fault because we should have told them better, but we didn't, and mainly because we didn't know. And this is a distillate of some of the things that we found to be common problems that we run into over and over again. So it's good, it's fun. One of the things that sort of drove me nuts when I first started dealing with students is I would hear things like this. And so the beauty of something as complex as a war between surface dwellers, mole people, factions with special abilities, area of effect spells, blah, 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 that actually tells me nothing about the game that they want to build. Nothing about the complexity of the game, nothing about what's required in the game. It's just a story that somebody has in their head. So 3 big things we're going to hit on: scope, understanding a mechanic, and then getting a sense of the cycle of development and all the things you need to do. And this is one of the things of, as game players, we understand games really well. Like, we've seen a lot of games, we've seen them deeply, we know how these pieces interact, we're knowledgeable people. It's a picture of the Ra. This was a ship built by Thor Heyerdahl, and people are probably too young to have heard of the Kon-Tiki expedition, but this guy got famous proving that Polynesia was populated by people who got on these balsa wood rafts and would float across the Pacific, because he did that. He's that crazy. Then there was this element of, could people from Egypt have reached North America? So what they did was they created this boat, the Ra, which they built with papyrus reeds and all this stuff. Really, really experienced crew. Like, they knew exactly what they were doing. I actually got a chance to meet the navigator on this, Norman Baker, amazing guy. And so they built this, and they're going to sail from Morocco to the Barbados. That was their target. They were following some ocean currents and stuff. Didn't work out quite as they had planned. About 600 miles from land, they ran into problems where the boat broke apart. And there's a picture that Norman has of him lying on one part of the boat, trying to hold on to the other part of the boat in the hopes they could make it another 600 miles. Didn't work. Now, what they realized was the reeds were fragile because of when in the year they picked them. And if you go in August and you harvest the reeds then, the sap has flowed all the way up and they are much tougher. And so they built the Ra too. Okay? So this is people who really, really know what they're doing. And these are the problems they get into. And something as small as what time of year you cut down these reeds, big thing. So one of the biggest things that, I am known for saying is scope matters. Scope is the #1 thing that kills new games. It crushes desires, it wrecks marriages. I'm sure it's responsible for some economic harm too. The big thing when you're starting out making games, you need to start with the smallest scope you possibly can, right? So think about something that you'd look at and say, that's not barely a game. That might be too big, right? If you don't get to the point that you can execute on these things effectively, you just won't be able to pull off a good game. I point you back to the Ra expedition of an incredibly talented group of people Small things, and they're floating in the water. We'll constantly hear things about students who want to put in achievements or in-app purchases. Oh, we've got multiple races or classes. Doesn't make a lot of sense. So achievements works if you got 20 hours of gameplay and somebody's played it and they've enjoyed 20 hours, and then they say, you know what? Let me try and do it with only this class of character. Let me try and do it this way. Let me try and do this strange thing. Yes, achievements are useful in extending play. You don't want to start there, right? It's just too much. In-app purchases are really complex. What you have to do is design a behavior and a need into the game such that somebody wants to give you money. So that's far beyond typical game design complexity. This is really a huge undertaking, something you really don't want to do. One of the things that I like and I sort of encourage is sort of this one-sentence description, particularly for professionals. If we're talking to other pros, Mastergy runs a pitch contest, which is February 22nd, 23rd this year. If you've got a game, you're an indie or a student, you can participate. We got like $2,000 in prize money, a bunch of other stuff, and a bunch of pros that will give you advice. In that pitch contest, the number one thing that people miss is they're talking to professionals. And if you're talking to a professional and you say platform, genre, art style, business model, and unique element, they know a ton about what you're talking about, right? They know so much. If you tell me what platforms it's on, I understand a lot about the game. If you tell me the genre, I know even more, right? Art style gives me a feel for things. How do you plan to make money? What's different about this game? Because we're not making new stuff. We're making the same stuff, looks different, or the balance curve's a little different, or we're making the same stuff with a twist. The plus one, as they like to call it. Here, something we've seen, added one thing to it. So if you get something like this, a PC-based RPG, steampunk art style, premium business model, and the items have a skill tree. I know a ton about that game, right? I could tell a long story about what this game is likely going to be. I can tell you how much content they're trying to build. I can tell you the quality of the stuff that they're trying to do and how they see things. Now, that's so far out of scope. You need to come to something simpler. A mobile game that's hyper casual. Now, the beauty of mobile games is up till now, they pushed a sense of smaller scope, right? Just because that's what people were used to seeing. But now when you see some really big high-end games showing up on mobile, I think that's going to wreck it. But it's a thing to do. The other thing with mobile that we like is you can demo it anywhere. So we go to festivals and events and other things, really easy to demo. You get a sense for it. But if you got a hyper-casual game, which is like one mechanic, done well, feels good, that's enough to do. So we sort of look at a game around a core mechanic. So there's got to be the thing that is the game. This is the fun in the game. And it kind of blows my mind sometimes when, if you watch somebody play a game, and you're not looking or listening to what's going on, and you're just watching their hands. And then if you use some video trick and disappear the controller, and you just have somebody going like this for hours on end, what the hell was it that made them do that? I mean, the movement itself is not enjoyable. You go and play a sport, whacking a tennis ball feels good. Hitting a golf ball feels good. Pushing a button doesn't particularly feel good. So there's been something that's been delivered that sort of pulls you in, and that's that core mechanic. Layers on top of that really make the experience go. The plus ones are really the things that, okay, you've played for this period of time, let me give you a twist. You've done this, let me add a little more to it. Let me add a little bit more complexity. All of these things to carry you through it. The whole element of a difficulty curve, a spiral as things move up in terms of complexity. As you start to build large games, the more complexity you need, it just keeps going, but it all starts simply. Win-lose conditions. And although I was watching something whose name I can't remember at all, but they were talking about games that don't have win-lose conditions, which is absolutely true. But for most of the games that we're going to build and that we see students building, there's a win-lose. And one of the things that kills me is when I hear, oh, well, we're going to make it easier because a lot of people die here. Okay? But if people don't die, what's the impediment to try it again? What's the feeling of winning if there isn't a sense of failing? So dying is not a bad thing. Dying over and over again and being almost impossible to move forward a little bit, that's a bad thing. But dying, not a bad thing. So having that sense is really important. One of the lines I heard that I really liked was, if you drive race cars, so if you're a race driver, and they say, if you don't have an accident 10% of the time, you're not actually trying. So you've got to be pushing somewhere at the edge. It's got to crash a little bit. For the player, it's got to feel that way as well. One of the things commonly overlooked is we're actually trying to create a loop of there's something the player's trying to do. When the player does it, when they achieve it, there's a sense of pleasure. The big element of this is the challenge has to be a challenge. They have to see it as something worth accomplishing. So that's a whole thing of it can't be too easy. It has to have that element to it. Failure, you've got to have failure. It's just, what's the word for it? It's required. And you want to introduce the player to it early. So FTUE is first-time user experience. As you take a player through it, and if you watch games, one of the things I'd encourage everybody to do is if a large company like King or Zynga put out a big mobile game, you should start to play it as soon as they put it out and watch what they do over a period of few months. You'll really see how they focused on this right at the beginning and it's good. And then they've added all of these other things that when you look at it down the road, it's this massive complex game, but it's all been layered on. So early on, you have to explain to the player what happens when you die. You know, what's the cost of death? How do you get back into it? All of that. Sense of achievement has to scale. It's one of the things that bothers me with superhero movies is every freaking time the world's going to be destroyed. And there's no, like, it's every time. I mean, they had to kill half the people in the universe to keep us going to these movies. There's got to be something where you're taking incremental steps to give that player that sense of achievement. And you have to recognize that they're getting there, and that's what gives them that feeling of pleasure. So this is an image from The Princess and the Pea. How many people know this fairy tale? Okay. I was looking at it and I realized what a terribly misogynistic story it is. But it illustrates a point, so I'm going to use it. King's got a son, wants a son to marry a princess. For whatever reason, women just show up and claim to be princesses. How do you tell if it's a real princess? Like, there's no way to go to the other kingdom and say, hey, this your daughter? No. For whatever reason, they decide the method is they're going to put a pea. They're going to put a pea at the base of a stack of mattresses and let her sleep there that night. And most of the fake princesses would get there, and the next morning they'd say, how'd you sleep? Oh, wonderful, it was great, softest bed I've ever been in. But what they were looking for was the one who complained, because she could sense the pea, as tiny as it was, that tiny imperfection. That's what made her notice it, and that's what proved she was a princess. And so this is the thing for me of that core mechanic, that starting point in a game. If you don't really nail that, it doesn't matter what you add to it. It doesn't matter how beautiful the game is. It just lacks a certain essence to it, right? So one of the games that I find interesting is this does it differently here. All right, let me back off that. So one of the things that this game had right at the start was your shots bounced. That's really cool. That's different than most games that you play where you're shooting people. The game can get extremely interesting as you go deeper and deeper into it, into the various places you bounce your shot. And so you can be sitting there looking for 8 bounces before you hit the target you're trying to go for. That elemental thing makes it really interesting. And doing that right, making the feel of that right, how it looks, they've got the element of your breathing, so your aim isn't perfectly steady, so the more bounces and distance, the more chance of error, all that stuff, but it gives you a really good experience. What they did is they took the bounce shot, and then they said, okay, great, the bounce shot works, it's wonderful. Now, when people get sort of bored and tired of that, or it's just something that's there, now we can add different kinds of weapons. Now we can add weapons with different ranges or things like that. We can bring in certain character classes. We can mix up different kinds of missions. We can mix up party size, all this sort of stuff. If the shooting wasn't fun, none of the other stuff would be fun. Because the shooting's fun, they can add more and more to it to make it fun for the long term. Now, this is a model we use that is loosely or substantially stolen from Ubisoft's design model. And one of the things that they say, and this actually is something that will stop students for hours, is if you say a mechanic has a variable that can be changed to make the task harder or easier. In the game, one variable that I can change that's going to make it harder or easier. If you can get to that, your first simple games, then you know really where you're starting. If you're dealing with something where I've got 6 layers of stuff packed together, you're not actually going to see that essence. You're not going to get that part right. So they look at it in sort of 3 large categories: physical, mental, and social. So physical ones are the ones that we see most often. It's timing, it's speed, it's accuracy, all those certain things that, okay, the amount of time you have to make this decision, that's what I'm going to vary. That's all I'm varying. And that's what's my core mechanic, okay? You've got to hold the stick steady. I have slight tremors in my hands when I do fine tasks. I can't do first-person shooters, can't play snipers. Hell, Skyrim's a problem. So I use a lot of big spells. But all of those things are different elements to it. In the mental stuff, when you're building puzzles, right, your ability to see how many steps ahead, what are the things that I unlock? Let me remember this, this, and this before I put this together. All of those sorts of things become elements of a mental game. Increase the amount of memory you need to have to do it successfully, you've made it harder. The last one's social, and this is advanced, and when you're doing big things like multiplayer, which you should never do unless you have a lot of money, a ton of experience, and a wife or husband with a really good job, because it's tough. But there's a lot of things you can do with that. We have this game that we made called Raise the Base. It's pretty straightforward. You're in the middle. If a green arrow hits you, you get a speaker. If a red arrow comes in the middle, it kills you. And you use the speakers to block the red arrows. Really straightforward. Biggest problem was, how do we balance a game like this? How do we make this game actually fun? I'm not going to say that. So one of the things that we had to get into was dying wasn't dramatic enough. When we started, somebody died, it was just, that's it. It would blink and it would cut back over to the start again. Well, people didn't really understand they were dying. Dying didn't feel like anything. It was no big deal. When they did the animation of somebody getting essentially electrocuted and all of that, and even though that only played for like a second or a fraction of a second, it was enough to give that player that feeling of failure and knowing what was happening there. But we still had the balance problem. So when we looked at it, we say, okay, how fast can I make those red things go? So the atomic variable, the one variable that we focus on, is the speed of the arrow. So you look at that and you go, what's the slowest it can go? Well, if you're playing a game like this, 2 seconds is an eternity, right? You probably want it 1 second or less. What's the fastest it can go? Well, we can look at human reaction time, average of a quarter second. You can look at if I have one speaker and the red arrow's coming from the other side, the short distance, the speed that I can rotate that one speaker to that point plus a quarter of a second, that's the fastest it can go. Right? It's just a real simple way to say, these are my bounds for easy and hard, and now I have a sense of how to work it. Our old friend Mario. So, never been a big Mario game player, but one of the things that I got into is there's a certain zone that I can jump from. Why isn't that second thing showing up? Okay, there. I don't know why. There's a certain zone. If I jump here, I will land on the other platform. If I jump in the other spots, I won't. Okay? And just assume that there's a barrier in front. Now, if I take that and I say, okay, I'm going to move that platform, maybe I'm not moving that platform. Did this crash? One moment. There. If I move that platform, it reduces the space I have to jump. And so just by moving that platform, what I'm doing is I'm making it harder for the player based on where it is. And the hardest it can be is the position where only one of those arcs works. So you keep everything else the same, and you're able to vary this game and move it all around. Now, once you get that, once the leaping to the platform's the fun part, the next thing you can do is the platform itself moves a little bit. Platform moving a little bit changes the timing of what you've got to do. That adds another level of interest. But that's all you really need to do. So if you look hard at, any sort of a game and you see that, wow, there's a ton of things that we can vary. And if we start with one of them and we get it right and we get a good balance and a feeling to it that's right, we can then extend from there. If the core of the game is fun, you can build a fun game. I look at something like Flappy Bird, which is a direct ripoff of the old helicopter game from, the 80s when I used to play it. But it's a really simple game. Really simple game, and it's a hard game. You die a lot. But that feeling, just that timing of when I decide to hit the thing, that carries it through. So doing the math again, if you take it and you say, all right, I'm going to take 30 to 70% of the number that I have, and I'm going to vary my difficulty in this range before I add something new on. So I've given the person the experience of starting here, it's gotten harder, And now I want to layer on something that adds to complexity. It isn't completely different. It doesn't take you a different way. It just adds to the complexity. The example of this is we did this game years ago called Hibachi Hero. And in this game, food would drop from the sky, and you'd have to pick certain things. They'd end up on this grill at the bottom, and then when they were cooked, you'd have to pick them off for a certain meal. So it was kind of dropping is the Fruit Ninja and whatever that chef run around the table game is. It was a combination of that. The problem was the dropping and the keeping your eye on the dropping was a different kind of a skill and different kind of experience than watching the bottom and waiting for that stuff to cook. That difference broke the game. So when we got it, we were testing and we see, all right, this breaks it. You take that out, and now all we're doing is dealing with the dropping. The game gets much better. How fast can the objects go? Well, we can look at this and we can see how many objects, where they go, how fast we can actually drive it. One of the things that psychologically works with people is this sense of accomplishment. And it's the essence of, I've played this game, I'm winning. Geez, it's getting harder. It's really hard. And then I beat that level. The next level after I beat it is really easy. It's intentionally designed to be much easier because now that win, surviving that last level, feels so much better. And that win carries me through more levels and more struggle before I go through that experience again. And if you can tune that right, you can keep people moving through huge amounts of content because that feeling of win, that whole sort of achievement pleasure dynamic is there and it's carrying you through. So understanding your core mechanic is probably the number one thing. We've gone from, everything we used to do, we tossed it all away. Last summer, we focused in on, we've got one mechanic, and you're going to take a shot. Every team is going to do multiple prototypes off that mechanic. So take that mechanic and play with it in different ways. And as you play with it in different ways, now you begin to see the potential and the feel for it, and you can actually build a game. And I'll say that the games that we did last year, substantially better than the games that we had done in years before, as we got things focused in. The next level of issue is the player. And this is the thing that comes up the most. Does the player understand the controls? Do they have a sense of what your core concept is? Do they know when they win? Do they know when they fail? These are things where repeatedly, especially, and we do a lot of in-person testing. Like we start, our first play test is a week and a half after we start building. So not a lot of time in, week and a half, and we bring in a class full of sixth graders who are really mean people. And they take it and they try it and they look at it and they look at the art style and all this stuff. And you begin to realize they don't understand what's going on here. Our game doesn't make sense to them. I can't describe it to them in a way that makes sense. They don't understand what they're supposed to do. When we start bringing professional mentors in, number one thing that comes up there is, I don't understand what just happened. I died, but I don't know why I died. I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. There's no feedback. There's no understanding of that element. And without that, it becomes really hard for them to sort of engage with the game. And focusing into that whole aspect, that's really the hard part. The thing that amuses me, but in an evil way, is when we start every summer, we'll have, brand new bunch of students, and we show them games from previous years. And at some point in time, I'll be walking past them, and I'll hear somebody say something to the effect of, I don't understand what the big deal is. That's 2 weeks worth of work. And it's like, core mechanic might be 2 weeks worth of work. Getting a game so people understand what's happening, to have a balance curve, to have all of the other elements in it that actually make it a game, that's a hell of a lot more work. I'll refer you to Owen Leach's slide from this morning, of little things of like a saving, option screen, all that sort of stuff is hard work. And so we spend so much of our time saying, stop adding to the scope, because it's hard not to. Because you've really experienced incredible games, and you know what an incredible game should have, and you're desperate to build an incredible game, but you keep layering things on. And that's the struggle. The other element in this is sort of how the player discovers your game. And that's this element of affordance versus limitations, what they're able to do versus what they're not able to do. Without giving a player limits, you take away some of the fun. Figuring out a game is, okay, you've put me in this situation and there's only 3 things I can do from this situation. Got it. If you put me in this situation and there's 10,000 things I can do, that's not as interesting. That's harder, that's more complex. There's a whole bunch of psychology behind when you get a certain amount of choice, it becomes almost impossible to make a decision. When you're limited to a few things, it's much easier to make that decision. There's things that you want to tell the player. And one of the other things that I've lately gone on a bit of a tirade about is you don't want to build a tutorial. A big, heavy tutorial like you see in high-end games is hard to build. It's hard to make it interesting. It's hard to make it feel right, all of that stuff. What you really want to try and do is make it so the game itself explains itself. It's obvious what to do. There's only this and this. Okay, we did a game a few years ago called Cat Tsunami, and it has one of the best trailers of any game we've ever made. The game itself, not very good. Problem with the game was the control scheme was 2 things. You tap on either side of the screen and it would make the cat go forwards and backwards. Now this was a cat surfing on a wave of cats, which as a descriptor is an excellent description of a game, right? You tell somebody, all right, I got a game about a cat surfing on a wave of cats. Who doesn't want to play that? Dog people, that's it. Other than them, everybody wanted to play it. Now, the problem with the control scheme here, which we didn't, I mean, hell, I didn't understand it till years after. So I'm no genius. The problem with the control scheme was the forward and backwards. When you're surfing, when you're on that surfboard, there is a sense of up and down, but there's no sense of I can move forward or backward. Right? If we wanted them to think forward or backward, we'd have to have a wave where they could lean into or lean back on and change that. But it didn't make sense visually. And, you know, we loved the trailer, like awesome, awesome trailer. And we had a publisher for it even, right? And we test it and people like it and they're saying good things about it. So the publisher does a soft launch. They go to the Philippines and they spend a little money and they get a couple hundred people to play it. Our tutorial completion rate for 2 buttons, 2, right, dropped 80% when it went to people we weren't watching. There's this thing called the Hawthorne effect. The Hawthorne effect is as soon as somebody knows or thinks they're being observed, their behavior changes. So if you stand in front of somebody and you go, I'm not going to say anything, I want you to tell me everything that's wrong with the game, you're not going to get an honest answer from them, right? You won't, and it's that discovery. The player has to develop this sense of the world you're building, but it has to somehow fit in with how they see the world themselves. So forward and back doesn't work for surfing. Games are like ogres. Ogres are like onions. Onions have layers. Ogres have layers. Games have layers. That's all I have to say about that. The layers of a game, and this is one of the things that I often struggle with, is you start off with a base mechanic. That simple thing at the beginning. And if you're a student, I would do a bunch of games with just one basic mechanic until I got really good at doing that. And then I'd slowly add a layer or 2 at a time. And that'll save you from planning a game for a year that you have no hope in hell of building, to, you know, one step, one step, one step. Your next game will always be better than the one you're currently working on. You'll have learned something, it'll get better. You can add +1 to the mechanics. So I'm going to change this mechanic to add some complexity. Okay, great. It's be a little harder. Above that's what I would call a system. So if you think about first-person shooter, the stealth movement, that's a system on its own. It's a combination of things as to how I move stealthily around it, how I'm detected, and all of that. That sits next to a system that's different, which is the combat system and how my weapons and all that work. So each one of these is coming from a core that they've built and they've put together, and they've got systems. One of the things that we had tried to do was we brought in a really good designer. So, you know, worked on BioShock, I'd been around for a long time, started a company, and he was, and I said, look, I don't know anything about design, and we student designs aren't very good. You got to help us, come on in. He came in and he started talking to him, and then halfway through the talk, I came to the realization, when he was talking to people, he assumed that everybody on the team could build a first-person shooter, and had built several very good first-person shooters and understood how all the systems interconnected. No. We were still at, we need to make a good mechanic. And that was the thing that sort of broke the logjam for us as to why aren't we getting better stuff, as we had to go back to that mechanic. Now, you can have different game modes. So I'm going to, you know, Iron Man, you know, there's no saving. I'm going to do this or this. You're going to play the game with a different set of rules. Same game, same content, just the rule set is a little different, making it harder. So I can add modes. I can add a meta. I can add things that sort of give me a sense of the game changes over time. And for online games and things like this, this becomes a big deal. So if you think about this, right, the games that we're used to playing, the games that all people have seen, they've got all of this, right? They understand the meta. There's, one of my favorite meta things was Call of Duty. I forget which version of it. Snipers were overpowered. And so what they did was they changed the amount of time it took the scope to sort of sight in by 0.02 seconds. They changed that, and it completely changed how the game was played. It changed how all of the classes were played, because now the sniper was not that powerful. So that's a meta level change in the game. That one element changed the whole thing. I play a lot of Puzzle and Dragons, and I spend a lot of time and I build a strong team and I'm doing really good, and then they change something, and I'm not going to spend my life reading details on what you did to this game, and my teams don't work anymore. And I'm getting my ass kicked all over the place, and then I got to go and figure it out and build new teams. But what they've done is they've given me a way to engage with this content in a new way. So I had the fun of building a good team. Now I needed to build a new team. Now, Puzzle and Dragons is a really simple match 3 game, right? You match 3, you match more than 3, and it shoots and it kills the monster. Great. The one thing the twist they added to it, was it wasn't just move one thing, one block. You had a period of time and you could move it all over the screen, and as it moved, it would displace blocks. So now you could try build more complex patterns. That in itself was fun. Okay, so match 3, fun, simple mechanic, you understand it, you know how to handle a little balance curve there. Now this movement makes it more complex, but it makes it interesting. You play this longer. Then they added things like different kinds of monsters and their powers and all of that stuff. So the more of that they added, the more complex it was, and the more you would play it. I've played that game for 2,000 days. I've actually logged in and done something in that game, which is remarkable, right? Really, really well-designed game. Layers upon layers. Rewards. They need to scale with the challenge. And there's elements of longer term things. Now, I know this goes against my mantra of simplicity, but if you think about something like WoW, it was a big deal to get him out in WoW in the early days, right? That was something you would aspire to for a longer period of time. So you had your short term, I want to kill this mob. Your longer term, I want to get to level such and such, the next level, the next 10th level where I get more powers, to there's a long ways off, I get this mount, I get this power. Those are all things that layer in and extend that motivation, which don't work unless the core is good. The reward serves a purpose, right? And the purpose sort of falls into two categories. It's functional, I'm more powerful, I'm able to do whatever, or it's social. I can show people that I've got epic armor, or I've got this cool mount, or I've got whatever else. Either one of those things function as a reward, and it's something that people can do. When they look at sort of the value of rewards, so there's an element of status. I've hit a certain level of status. Because of that, people know I'm special. There's access. I can go to places where others can't go, because I can go to those places that makes me feel special. And this, I mean, playing games is essentially making the player feel special, because apparently life is really hard. There's the ability to have power over others. You know, I'm leader of the guild. I'm selling essential oils through my friends. Any of these things give people actually a sense of accomplishment. It baffles me in all these wacky multi-level marketing things of how good people feel when they have more layers below them, not just because of the money, but because there's layers below them, right? It gives them that sense. And then there's stuff. It's collecting things and holding. It's amazing the value people get from collecting. There was, back in the old days, there was a guy, Edward Casanova, he was an economist, who studied games. And they did a bunch of studies, and they said, you know, when you've got a character that you develop for a period of time, the way somebody feels about the character is the same way as they feel about a capital good. So a car, a washing machine, something big and durable, the character is there. My last company, we worked a lot with MMOs. When we started, WoW was just, level cap was 60, right? And everything was really cool, and there were a ton of MMOs being built, and there were hundreds of millions of dollars pouring into it. As they came out, one after another, and they'd be, you know, like the Conan one, so, all right, it's gonna be M-rated. That's different than WoW, so it's harder. The combat system's a little more complex, so, you know, it takes a more thinking person to play this thing. The game didn't really go anywhere. And there was a bunch of reasons, you know, technical and design-wise, but part of it was all of these people who played WoW had a kick-ass character. They'd been playing it for months, and they had a really good character that could do a lot of things. Then they go to start this new MMO, and their character can't do squat. You know, and the rules are different than the world they're used to, and it just doesn't feel right. So that sort of thing really took a while to stack up. So as I said, we start testing as soon as we possibly can. So there's a few things to remember. Number one, we are not normal, none of us, okay? We've played a lot of games. We are game developers. We think about games. Nothing we really see in a game we're making is true. You need real people. And you need fresh real people. So you need to be able to get lots of different people to test it. And the more people you can get to test it, and ultimately the more people who don't know you testing it, the better results you can get. When you do it, you're not just testing the core mechanic. You can test the art. You can test the concept of the world. You can test a whole lot of different things. The one thing I really like is there's a game called Mind the Arrow, which was built by a company called Petrichor, and they're students, they graduated, they had this stupid idea of wanting to start a game studio. I said, it's not gonna work, you'll be out of business in 3 months, but what the hell, it'll be fun. And They built a game in 3 months, which gave them not enough money to survive, but they picked up a whole bunch of contract development and are still in business. But in Mind the Arrow, it was this simple game that, and I encourage people to play it. I really encourage you, if you haven't played it before, is to get somebody who hasn't played it before to play it and watch their face. Because you start off and you don't quite understand the rules, and I've got to match this image here. Okay, I can do that, that's not that hard. Okay, a little more complex, not that bad. This is kind of boring, and then it changes. All of a sudden there's a change that's introduced, and you see people's face light up. And I go, okay, yes, you took something, I figured it out, it was good, but it was starting to get boring. Now you gave me a change that was interesting. And that's a thing you can only really see when you're play testing, when you're looking at it. The more variations you can test, the better. Asking people to give you a stream of consciousness. Some people can't do that. Others are really good at it. But as they're playing, to just keep talking about what they're seeing, what they're thinking, why they're thinking that. And that's where you get things like, such and such just happened. I don't know why that happened. Gee, what's this thing here? I want to try and get it. I'm trying to do this. I should jump. Here's how. No, that doesn't work. Well, what about this? What about this? All of those sorts of things give you a sense of how people are processing your game. We talk about building a game in stages. First one being white box. Some people like to use gray boxes. It's fine. White box just mean programmer art, core mechanic only. Is that fun? So if you've just got gray boxes sitting there and the mechanic works and is fun, then you know you've got something, that you're there. You can prototype this way really quickly. And by prototype, I mean something you're building as an experiment, but we'll throw away after. Work with a guy who really hates the word prototype. And I say it almost constantly. So you can try a whole bunch of different ideas around this. It's almost the thing of we're not trying to build the vision in our head, but the vision in our head is a direction. And okay, we're trying to head in this direction, but we need to feel what's fun around there. So if we take this concept and we try it different ways, we may find different elements that are really fun. And we follow that fun. Once you do that, going to a vertical slice. So I want one of everything that's going to be in my core game. So, okay, it's tower defense, I want, a tower, I want a mob, I want this, this, and this. These are all the things, so I can see how these things work together. From there, building out core code would be the next step, and now you're actually in production, right? I'd toss most of this into pre-production. You have to toss your code out between stages, and this is one of the things people struggle a lot with. It's a thing called technical debt. I'll let you read it. I'm not a very good programmer, but I have found it to be true, and every programmer I know has found it to be true. So if you write a piece of code and then you throw it away and write it again from scratch, it's much better than the first time you wrote it. You're doing something complex like a game, your variable names are wrong, how you've broken up classes are wrong, you did something quick and dirty over here to hide something, and that's going to break later on. It's a huge, huge problem. When we were working with MMOs, one of the things that every one of them wanted to do, our company did voice chat for games, just got bought by Unity, does everything from Fortnite to WoW to whatever else. I didn't do that part. But they'd say, hey, can you replace our text chat system? And, well, text chat, how hard is that? Why do you want us to do it? Well, text chat was something they slapped onto the side of the game. No programmer really wanted to work on text chat because it wasn't one of the sexy parts of the game. So they just slapped fixes here and there. Because it was a messaging system, other parts of the game started to use it as a pipeline to send messages to other parts of the game. So they had this really complex, crufted up system that they couldn't change because it would break the entire game, but it was terrible and nobody wanted to work on it. That's all technical debt. Once you've got a game, once you've built something and you put it out there, you want to understand analytics. And I think I'm going to stop here. But analytics is this whole element of seeing what happens to your game when it's in the wild. So this is something called pirate analytics. You can look it up. There's lots of good descriptions, but they take you through this element of awareness. Does somebody know your game exists? So if you're thinking about social media, whatever else, that's what you're trying to build, is a sense that you even exist. We run a student marketing team, and you start off first day with them, you say, so how are we going to market this game? And somebody says, social media. Okay, how many followers do we got? 120. How many copies do you think? And that 120 are all people we know. Is that going to work? Well, you've got to do a lot of other things to build awareness. If you don't build awareness, it's just not going to deliver anything. There's acquisition, and acquisition is essentially getting enough attention from this player that they go to the page where you install or you download or whatever. You've actually got them to the point they want to do something. From there is activation. In Steam, 70% of the titles in people's libraries have never been launched once. 70% of the titles haven't been launched once. We, back when I was working with the other company, we sold Riot Games, our system. It took them 12 years to implement it. Not because it was hard to implement, that's just when they got around to it. So people will buy your game, but they won't launch it. I used to be really good at buying books, mainly books that made me look intelligent, but not reading them. But if you walk past my office or my bedroom, you'd say, wow, he's a smart guy. No, more money than brains. So you want stuff to get them to activate, to get that movement through. The next biggest thing is retention, and this is the thing we spend the most amount of time on. So once we build a game, we actually pass it off to another team, and that team puts it into market. And we've got a marketing team that's operating now, and they do really well. They can get you 200 users at the drop of a hat. Jordan over there will do it. Wave, Jordan. Anybody want $200? Go see Jordan. 200 users, go see Jordan. For a small fee, he can do that for you. But all of a sudden, we have 200 clean users. And these users play our game without us tainting them in any way, shape, or form, and we get real data. And then we say, gee, I'm a genius designer. It's just got to be this. Let me tweak this, and that'll fix it. And then people understand how to be a genius designer is it's probably not that. But the more times you iterate on this, the more time you find ways past the block, the better a designer you become. And then eventually this becomes something that's second nature to you, and you're able to push through. Retention's the biggest thing. How long can I keep this person playing? If you look at your content, you say, okay, we built 10 levels, but they're 10 fun levels, and this is 10 minutes of joy playing this. All right, great. Get them to level 10 before you sweat level 11. Because if they're not doing that, we had one team come in who they launched one game on Steam, they graduated, I guess their parents were quite wealthy, they started a game company, they built one game, they were going to build a second game, and I say, first game, so how'd it do? Oh, we sold a bunch on Steam, not enough to live on, but, good number. Okay, yeah, what are your analytics telling you about it? When do people stop playing your game? Oh, about 15 minutes in. How much content do you have? About 20 hours. So, I know you want to build your second game, and you should, but if you don't take some time to figure out why all of that other time in the game content, which is wasted, isn't what you wanted to do. So getting that focus, retention, huge thing. Once you get retention nailed, you think about money and revenue, and then ultimately you want people to refer your game to others. You want people to say, this game's great, you should go play it. So if you think about the stack as you build games, you start simply, keep your scope managed, bit by bit, you build more complex things, you build something amazing, you get rich, you remember, Boston Fig, and you contribute as a sponsor. So, great. All right, 5 minutes for questions, if there are any.
I'm curious about these small games that you're recommending. How do you measure the success of that? So a student's making this game and they get 200 downloads. Is that good? Like, how do you measure it?
So I'd say there's two separate things, okay? So they get 200 downloads. Well, that's because they have no marketing budget or no marketing skills. We have proven that you drop any game out there and you tell all of your friends, you can get 200 installs. Okay? My cat can get 200 installs. But if you market it well, we can get 200 installs over and over again. So some of these games we have thousands of players. So I wouldn't focus on the installs, I would focus on the retention. So I've built this game and people play it for 5-10 minutes. Okay, that's great. My next game, they spent 20 minutes playing. Awesome. Okay, now I'm actually getting better. The player is having fun. It's still nowhere close to what you need to make money, but you're getting better. You're actually experiencing and doing it, making all that stuff better. So, splitting those two marketing is a whole different beast. All right, cool. Since half of you have asked me questions on this before, thanks a lot. We'll see you.